And Job can't answer. He can't answer yes or no. He's not able to create as God does. He's not able to understand as God does. And yet, a part of what this dialogue allows us to see is that God has not abandoned Job. God is willing to continue the covenant relationship and to be in conversation, the conversation that we call prayer, with this human being. By the end of the story, Job acknowledges that he does not have God's understanding or creative power. And as Dr. Mark reminded us last week, we are not God. God's in charge of the world, not us. But we may have conversation, that is, prayer with God. Even when we do not understand all that happens, God is still there. God is willing to have the conversation with us, to walk with us through all that happens. In the very end, Job not only has hope, but assurance that God has not abandoned him. Job admits that he does not understand why things happened as they did, that he may not have the big picture. But Job does accept that in the big picture, God is just, and God remains committed to the covenant with humans. That is the Bible's story. God does not abandon his people. God stays committed to us, and we in turn need to put our complete trust in God. For times such as these, the story of Job may offer us some light at the end of the tunnel when we ourselves face trouble, difficulty, even calamity. We may not understand why things happen to us or happen in the world as they do. What we can hold on to is that God is still God and that God cares for us. It may take us a while to come to this place as we wrestle with what is going on in our particular situation. And sometimes our friends can't help us. They certainly cannot hurry us into an understanding or an acceptance of God's possibilities. But our ability to understand and accept does not change God's nature or God's being. In the recent issue of Guideposts magazine, Paul Young, the author of The Shack, tells his story. He had a horrific childhood, and as a result, he acted out in his adult life, doing things to put his marriage and his family in jeopardy. Finally, faced with losing everything and everyone he had come to hold dear, he faced the reality of his own actions and the truth of what had been done to him. Part of dealing with all that had happened was that Paul Young began to write a series of conversations, and those eventually became the book known as The Shack. And in that story, God was not who was expected, and God did not act in ways that were always understood by the father in the story. By the end of that story, the father accepted that God had the bigger picture, and that God could, and that he, Paul Young that is, could as well as needed to trust God to bring him through the ups and downs of his life. Another story concerned Mike Singletary, the great defensive back of the Chicago Bears and later coach of the 49ers. Mike also had to learn to let go and let God. Again, with a difficult childhood, he had learned to focus very intently on his goals and particularly on his football career. He had let relationships take second or third or fifth place. Football was his chief priority. Only when he was in danger of losing his wife and 7 children did he step back and turn over the control of his life to God. So what about us? We live in a culture that still tells us that prosperity is a sign of favor, that we can avoid all the rough places in life, and if bad things happen, it's basically your fault. That's the world's message, but it's not God's word for us. No one is immune from trouble. We will all face arid spaces, times that make us feel we are in a desert, far away, perhaps even abandoned, that God is not near. Or, as the words in our last hymn say, we're going to go through deep waters, waters that could drown us. And we remember that Jesus faced such times in his own life when he wondered if God was present. He went through those dry spaces and those deep waters. At the very beginning of his ministry, he was tempted by wealth and power and chose not to give in to those temptations. He had no permanent home. His friends did not understand him, and one of them betrayed him. And Jesus' final temptation was to abandon the call, the work for which he had come. But he chose to follow God, even through that horrific death on the cross. And as the letter from Hebrews told us, he was tempted as we are, but without sin, not because he could not choose that way, but because he chose to completely follow God's will. We are not always able to completely follow God's will, but we have Jesus to intercede for us. And when Jesus does that, it is as if the slate is wiped clean and we are able to start over. We start afresh each time we ask for that forgiveness and for that help. And when we face not only temptations but hard times that will be part of every life, it is then that we need to turn to God, to trust God to walk with us, to see us through those dark, rough, arid places. There is a little poem that describes how God is sometimes present with us. I can't quote it exactly, but it begins by a person asking for God's help. And God sends a butterfly to land on their shoulder, but the person doesn't see it or acknowledge it. The person cries out again to God. God sends a beautiful sunset, but again, the individual is too wrapped up in their own misery to acknowledge God's gift. Finally, after several more cries and answers that God thinks the person will understand, the person believes that God has abandoned them and turns away. But we know that such is not the case. God is trying to make contact and remind that person and us that he is present and comes to us in a way we can understand. So today I invite you to take a look at what is going on in your life. Have you offered whatever difficulty you find yourself in to God in prayer? If you are having trouble believing that God is for you, that God is not absent, is there a friend with whom you might talk or pray? Part of the role of this faith community, of any faith community, is to support one another through times of trouble. And one way we do that is by praying for one another. Another way we support one another is by telling and retelling the story of God's faithfulness to us through times of trouble. And that is where this story of Job is part of the story that we share. That God is with us, that God intends to remain in covenant partnership with us. God offers us hope for the future, is the story the Bible has to share with us. For nothing can separate us from the love of God. God will not abandon us, even when we can't understand what is happening. Thanks be to God.